It's nice to meet you. Hello.
Nice to meet you, Heather. I'm glad we worked out a time.
Yes, took a little while, but here we are. So to start off with, would you just like to say your name and where you are, please?
Sure. My name is Amber Mays, and I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Wonderful. And the first big question is, who are you? And that's you as a human being. It can be passions, values, qualities about yourself, whatever you'd like to share.
I love this. This is Gestalt.
Kind of.
Okay, who am I? I think the first thing that comes to mind when you ask that question is I'm just a forever learner. I just am always interested in learning and growing and evolving. I remember actually having a conversation with an ex of mine and saying, well, what are relationships for if not to learn and grow? And he said to me, fun, maybe? And I said, okay, this probably isn't the best relationship, not because I don't believe in fun, but I do, but because it's just such a fundamental value of mine that, you know, so much of my work and my presence on this planet for however long I'm here is to really support people in learning and growing and healing and, you know, just having as rich an experience as possible. I think a lot of that has to do with being second generation in organization development and social justice work. My mother passed about 10 years ago. She was from Greece originally, came over here when she was 19. And my dad is African-American from Albany, Georgia, in the US. And they met actually in a community psychology program at Boston College. And they were very much a part of civil rights. And so they actually developed a practice together doing organization development and cross-cultural communication work. And so I was kind of born into a family that was very much about learning and growth and social justice. And
that sounds like a really cool family business.
Yeah, it really was. It really was. And I have to say, I tried doing something different. I had also an interest in math. So I tried to be in the financial world and learned very quickly that was not for me. So the apple did not fall far from the tree. I just feel like I didn't really have a choice in the matter. So that's a bit about who I am. I would say, you know, a big part of my coaching and diversity, equity, and inclusion practice is really about people understanding themselves better so that they're able to make the changes that they see fit to make in themselves and in their systems. So kind of paradoxical theory of change-ish, as I later found out when I did my Gestalt training.
Go. So what are some of your particular passions? Is there a particular kind of learning? Is there a thing that I mean, I have met some surprise mountain climbers, things like that. I don't know.
That's great. Well, it's interesting that you say that because I've been thinking lately about merging two of my passions. One of them really is coaching. I absolutely love I do a fair amount of executive coaching, leadership coaching. These days, I've been working with a lot of women of color in terms of understanding how to really be leaders in their own right and be fully themselves in systems that are insisting that they change who they are. And so I bring a lot of Gestalt work to my coaching. And I also love hiking. So I've been thinking lately about bringing coaching to the outdoors and kind of using nature and the experience of walking and movement and just bringing that into the coaching arena. So two of my passions coming together.
Interesting. Okay. And what about other human beings? Who would you say has been one of the most significant influences on you?
Oh, there have been so many. I would say In the professional world, it was my mentor who has passed. He passed a few years back, Dwayne Wade. He was someone who really taught me the power of being kind and speaking truth at the same time. He was one of the most amazing, skilled people at being able to say what is so when it's so without shame, blame, judgment. And it really helped me understand how I wanted to be in the world, in all the work that I do, and also in friendships and relationships. It helped me define what kindness is, as opposed to niceness, which for me is a completely different thing. That, niceness can be smiling in your face and then doing or saying something that's quite opposite, behind your back. Kindness for me actually really includes respecting people enough to name what is so, and respecting the world enough to call truth to power, and to really name, the system dynamics that are up, and to give people opportunities to respond to the truth. So Dwayne was wonderful with that, and he also had this amazing sense of humor. And that's one of my core values. I mean, he used humor in a way that was not, it didn't demean anybody, right? It wasn't at anybody's expense. He may have been self-deprecating, from time to time, but it was a connecting kind of humor that would have you kind of experience that emotion that I think we don't really name, which is, like laughter through tears, right? You can be in a painful situation, but then have this, joyous experience that comes in those moments. So he was really my kind of hero when it came to that.
And that's one of my favorite elements of therapeutic practice, actually, is humor. So that's really interesting. And I like what you say about kindness. I'm just sitting with that still.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I am also wondering a little bit about your own history and what would come to mind for you as a particular event or as a set of circumstances in your life that you would say significantly marked you or changed your path in some way or yourself?
It's a great question. Well, I would have to say having my mom pass was the most significant thing. She was really my best friend in the world. And, we talked every day, for as long as I had been on the planet. And then when it was clear that, she had a limited time on this earth, I went and spent every day I could, next to her until she passed. And, not only the grief, of course, that's quite transformative to go through grief and loss, and to live with grief and loss. That was a part of it. And I think that piece has really helped me be extremely empathetic to people who experience loss of any kind, and to understand the nature of grief, that it's not something that happens and then you're done, but that it's kind of, a process in itself. That, and depending on the magnitude of it, that you live with, right? But I also think that experience, because I got to be so close with her in the end, it gave me kind of a way of honoring what it means to transition out of life. It's like we do all this celebrating of birth. But I don't think, at least in the US, there aren't many cultures that I know, in terms of mainstream cultures, I should say, that do a good job of honoring the passage out. And so I look at that time as, so that was, it was a time of honor for me to be able to be there with her through those final days. So very significant for me.
I'm sorry for your loss in a way, but I still haven't found the right way to express sort of the complexity of that kind of stuff. But
Yes.
I think, there's more to that sentiment. So
yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. yeah, I've gotten to a place of kind of saying, I witness, I honor, and, I see your loss. I've actually, it's interesting, in the last couple of years, I've been connected to people who have had significant losses, like losing children, and I can't think of anything worse, but, and I've just learned so much about what it means to just be with people in their loss and not try to change it and not try to appease or fix or say something in the moment that's gonna somehow make it all better, but to just kind of, bear witness and to sit with and be with people.
Yes.
Yeah.
So actually it is kind of connected to this, and I usually get there the other way around. But I'm interested about where you are in life in terms of your relationship with your age and the aging process, which, at some point will also come to an end. So
There we go. We got there this way.
yeah.
The equifinality thing. Yeah, let's see. So I'm 47 now. And it's interesting. I'm starting to be in a place where I don't really, I'm like, am I 47, or am I 48? I'm just kind of confused about the number. And I think that's indicative of the fact that I'm actually enjoying my life more and more and more. There's not a time in my life where I want to go back and, like have my great time in my 20s. I really don't want to go back there. I feel like I'm a much happier, more grounded, centered person than I ever was when I was younger. So I'm appreciating it. I'm actually finding every year I'm here, more grace, more space to be myself, to set boundaries. I heard someone say the other day, boundaries are her love language. And I said, I love that.
Mm.
So just to be able to be fully me, I'm not there, I think again, I'm a lifelong learner, but I'm enjoying life more every year. And that doesn't mean it's not complex and there aren't, ups and downs and hugely painful experiences that still, happen. So I guess I would say I'm appreciative of the aging process, and hopeful for what's next.
And what about your experience of yourself within your gender or as a woman? How is that? How are you understanding and going through that?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Well, I've done a lot of work on myself in the last, I would say, 5 years on how I think about gender. And I think, the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion and society at large has all been, making gender identity more figural than it has been in the past. Not that there wasn't a complete continuum and, myriad ways of identifying around gender before, but it's just the awareness loop, in terms of what's been mainstream has increased. So I would say, being a cis woman, I have more recently noticed that I'm leaning more into my privileged side of things, rather than looking at, for years and years, I looked at my marginality as a woman in the business world and the ways that I was not listened to and the ways I had to repeat myself and the ways I needed to navigate the power structures that be. And now I'm really looking at, the privilege that I have to really be clear that, my gender identity aligns with my assigned identity at birth and what that means. And also kind of my gender expression and all of those things falling within what, society would say is normal and right. And so I've been really paying attention to that. And, even in my diversity, equity, and inclusion practice have evolved the way that I even talk about gender, based on my awareness and the mistakes that I've made, around being very socialized into a binary. It's like just noticing how much that's just been in me and how much work I've needed to do to pay attention to that and to create new neural pathways, and just in terms of my language and how I think about things. So, yeah.
And I mean, you have kind of stepped into some aspects of my next question, which is how you would, I don't know what you would like to share about your relationship with privilege and power.
Mm, yeah. Yeah. Well, privilege and power, it just is, right? It is, it's like, it's what we live in. Yeah, it's interesting because I just filled out a form. It's actually a model that I created with a colleague, where you have to go through and look at all of your kind of aspects of identity and, mark where you're privileged and where you're marginalized. And so,
I made one of those too. I'd
yeah,
love to
yeah.
see yours.
Yeah, so we've been using it, actually teaching coaches how to integrate diversity, equity, and inclusion into their coach practice, and to be, coaches that are really attending to social identity in responsible ways and aware ways. But I did it for myself so that we could have an example. I just updated it. And I was like, wow, look at all my privilege. It's like listen, I'm, privileged by class. I'm privileged by sexual orientation, being heterosexual. I've just talked about my gender identity. I am privileged around education. I'm privileged around ability. I'm US born. We think about the power structures in the world. I mean, there were few things that were actually marginalized identities. And so for me, it's always about, what am I paying attention to, and when have I fallen unconscious again? Because it's so easy for me to go on autopilot and not pay attention to the areas where I'm privileged. Lately, I've actually been looking at skin color privilege, because although I identify as mixed race, although, internally my identity is not white, I am white presenting. And so the way it's manifested, although I've thought a lot about it in my life, is around facilitating conversations, specifically around skin color and race, but really around skin color, and thinking about, when am I chosen to facilitate these conversations, because white systems are much more comfortable with me. And am I the right person to be facilitating this conversation, to be centered? And so I've been doing some work, just kind of being in those questions, if you will. And I've turned down a lot of work over the last year. I can go into that more, but, there was a whole upsurge in wanting DEI work
Right.
after George Floyd's murder. And so I've been really intentional about the work that I'm taking, with a lot of systems that are really unconscious in their privilege, saying they want to do work, but then not really wanting to do the work. So just questioning.
I was imagining that was the no pile.
That's the no pile. That is the no
Yeah.
pile. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
So those have been intentional and interesting conversations. So I found myself being in a place of, privilege around class, that I have a lot of work coming in, and I've had a lot of ability to survive, this pandemic in ways that others absolutely have not. And at the same time, using that privilege to say, no, I don't need this work, and I'm not going to perpetuate systems that are just doing performative work. There's no way that I'm going to do that. I have a choice here. So yeah, that's been a part of it.
Yeah, I mean, that would make you complicit in a way, wouldn't it, with an unbalanced system?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And there's a lot of that happening.
There is. Actually, I just started making a list. I was like, yeah, okay. Yep. I live in a very small world, but yes, it's yeah, my little sample is like, yes, I know what you're talking about there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Huh,
Definitely.
interesting.
Mhm.
So, what about Gestalt? Where did that come into your life? How did you come upon it? Did it find you? How did that happen?
Yeah. I'm kind of searching my memory about that. I think I always knew about Gestalt from the time I went to graduate school. I went to the American University NTL, National Training Laboratories, MSOD program. And so I knew people who were in Gestalt work, but I didn't know what the work was. And I would say years later, I had a colleague invite me to an experience with a couple of faculty members who were part of the Gestalt Institute. And I just had this mind-blowing experience where I was experienced personally, this amazing personal growth. And I loved it. And so one of them called me and said, how do we get you into this program? It was the, what was then called the Being an Effective Intervener program. It was, anyway, I think it went through iterations,
Yeah, I think that's a what can we make you that doesn't require a licensure program.
Right. We didn't have that then.
Yeah.
So yes, so I ended up, I had all kinds of, complaints about how I couldn't afford it and all, anyway, they wouldn't let it go. And I was very grateful that they didn't, because it was probably one of the most profound experiences of my professional career. I just learned so much about myself in the program, but I also learned more than I ever had about use of self, and particularly about presence, and how when we show up grounded and clear in our intents and create a space where people can fully see themselves, how change just happens, right? It's almost like this magic that happens. So I just fell in love with that, because that aligned with one of my core values around being present with people, about being with people and being authentic. And it was like I had found my way of being in the world in a field. So I loved it, and I integrated it immediately into all my work.
So it's weird. In Spanish, I was trained in Gestalt in Spanish. There's not a lot of talk about the use of self.
Yeah.
I mean, I get it, but I'm just wondering what you learned about using yourself. How do you use yourself? Like when you show up, what is your presence?
Yeah. Well, this is great, because I was just talking to some coaches about it who have been trained to do coactive coaching, and they're early in their career and kind of gravitating more towards just asking questions, that somehow there's more power neutrality and just curiosity and asking questions. And what was freeing to me about Gestalt is that using myself beyond just what my curiosity was, but also to name what I was noticing, to name what I was sensing, and then to check it out with, my client, of course, being client-centered, to use provocative and evocative interventions rather than just evocative, but to just, name a pattern that I had noticed and just see what happens, right? In very responsible ways, of course. I think, we've seen some media representations of Gestalt that look very irresponsible around like experimenting on people. I was watching something recently that was doing a spoof on Gestalt, and so I don't believe in that. But really about creating a space where we can experiment together and see what emerges, from how I'm intervening in the system with you, and then what, comes back to the interplay. And with that, there's so much personal work that's required to make sure that you're owning your projections, and that you're, not doing something where there's an abuse of power, or, schmirgling what's yours or what's mine, or, all of that. So it just requires
just don't schmirgle.
Don't schmirgle. Just don't do the schmirgle. Exactly.
So what would you say is the essence of your work?
Yeah, so I'm actually in a bit of a transition at the moment, where I'm doing a hybrid of leadership and diversity, equity, inclusion coaching. And then also doing some workshops and education with organizations, and then teaching coaches. So I've got, a variety of things that I'm doing. I would say the essence of my work is really helping people see systems, see themselves, and using the paradoxical theory of change to really support learning and growth. And pretty much everything I do has some sort of social identity lens woven in. That's the root of so much of my early training and the work that that I do in the world. But I'm doing less long-term diversity, equity, inclusion consulting these days. Just because it's not my preference. I think there's a lot of people out there that do it brilliantly. And I have come to see that even though Myers-Briggs said I was an extrovert for years and years and years, I think that was a learned extroversion. And there's a level of introversion that I'm attending to now. So I've needed some space from, large systems. So evolving.
Hmm. So, I mean, it sounds like part of your work is now more short term, but coming and going, finding, the sticking points in the systems. But what do you identify as some particular challenges that you run into in what you do and who you are?
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm really mindful of, because it is my value that the work that I do is it really leaves systems in a better place, is that because I've chosen some of the shorter term work, I need to know there's longer term work happening in the system, and that what I'm doing is synergistic and not a Band-Aid. So I will never come in and do an hour and a half webinar, on something as big as race relations, for example, which I got a lot of calls to do after George Floyd's murder. All of a sudden, we have a race problem. Can you come in and fix it in an hour and a half? And of course, that's clearly no. But when I am asked to come in and do a series of workshops, and I know and trust that there are consultants in the system and leaders in the system that are doing a long-term, committed, intentional, active process of change, and that this is going to be synergistic, then I'm good with it. So the challenge is I'm saying no a lot. And I'm having to do a lot of pre-qualifying calls to really get a sense of what's happening in systems beyond just talking the right talk. So, yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so what comes to you as a particularly satisfying experience? I mean, it sounds like, again, there's been a lot of no's and things that are not quite stacked up right with the right supports. Mm-hmm. But what would be an example for you of something that has been fulfilling?
Yeah, there's actually two recent ones. I've had a few coaching clients come back to me and tell me that the work that we did together completely transformed their lives. And there was a theme of really choosing work in the world that was more purposeful, that allowed them to be who they needed to be, who they wanted to be, to evolve, to impact the world in wonderful ways. So I've gotten great feedback lately from coaching clients that's just made me feel, just warm and happy about the impact. But then also this work that I've been doing with my colleague to teach coaches. We've developed a couple of workshops where we're really helping people understand how to effectively address issues of identity in coaching relationships. And we have been having a ball with that. It's just been just wonderful learning. Same thing, we're getting amazing feedback about the workshops. We decided to do it over, a few days with a lot of time so that we could do, in small cohorts, so we could really do some intensive work with people. And, we just looked at each other at the end of the last one and just said, was that work? That didn't feel like work.
Something I wanted to do.
Exactly, the whole time. So yeah, those are the recent ones, I'd say.
Okay. And back sort of with a foot in the Gestalt world, I mean, do you feel like you're part of a Gestalt community? Does that mean anything to you?
That's a great question. Um, yeah, I mean, here's how it's like, how can I qualify it? It's like, when you walk into, when you go to a country, that where you're not from, right? You're traveling and you find someone all of a sudden who speaks your language, your native language, and you're like, oh my gosh, hi. It's like, there's something about meeting other Gestalt trained folks where I feel that kind of sense of connection around how we do the work, how we think about the work, and how we do the work in ourselves, and the importance of doing our own self-work. So I feel it at that level. And then I also have some people that I'm, very, very close with from my Gestalt program as well. So there's that as well. Yeah, that's a great question. I would like more intentional Gestalt community now that you mentioned that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's something that has to be cultivated in different ways on different levels, right? But I want to come back to something that you mentioned that you do that it's a curiosity of mine. And I wonder, when you talk about leadership and leadership development, what is that for you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great distinction, because I think, people think of leadership as just positional power in organizations. And for me, we all have ways in which we step into leadership and out of leadership in our lives, right? And there's, how intentional are we about when and how we're leading? So when I'm talking about leadership, it's both positional. You may actually be a leader of an organization. But I also am talking about the ways that we model things, the ways that we influence other people around us, and the intentionality around that, how we think about ourselves as leaders in our lives. So it can be pretty broad. And I usually have to define it a little bit more specifically with each coaching client about how they think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So for example, right now I'm working with a client who is an executive director, but we're also talking about leadership in her life and where she wants to go with that. And, how is she leading at home? And, what kind of anti-racist leader does she want to be in the world? And, so there's a lot of ways it shows up.
Yeah, I mean, just out of my ignorance, I got so excited when I started hearing people talk about leadership development.
Mhm.
And then I realized that it was mostly within corporate power structures
Mhm.
and for immensely privileged tip of the iceberg kind of people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I'm like, maybe I'm a leadership person, maybe I'm a development person, but then none of it was going where I was expecting it to go. I would get excited about the words and then it would be totally disconnected from my
Yes.
actual interests. So when I hear someone talking about leadership development,
Yeah.
I'm excited to hear that it goes in a sense that's, beyond sort of that corporate structured
Yes.
sense.
It does for me, absolutely. And I think that that's the thing about language that's so interesting, right? It's like, depending on who's speaking the words and what context they're in, it can be a completely different thing. So digging down into the meaning is important. It's actually, you just made me think of one of the Gestalt concepts that was really helpful for me when talking about, kind of cross-cultural understanding is figure and ground. And I had a really interesting experience in my Gestalt program where I was watching two people who were in a learning dyad practice, and they were just missing each other entirely. And I was like,
I
they're
can't
not
believe
even,
it. That never
that
happens.
never happens. It's so rare. But what occurred to me is that they thought they were talking about the same thing, and they had completely different context. They had completely different ground, right? So they weren't even looking at the figure in the same way, right? It was like, so I was like, oh, this is what happens all the time in cross-cultural conversations. And so I'm using that a lot lately with people, for example, something happens and is that racist or not, right? And so there'll be a lot of white folks who'll be like, that's not racist, because of X, Y, and Z. And there'll be a lot of BIPOC folks that will be like, it absolutely is, because here's the whole history of race, in this country, in the world, and all of the things that you're missing in the context to see why this is a racist thing, right? So it was just such a mind-blowing Gestalt experience for me to understand it in that way, that, just how we even look at one thing with the context being different, can just, send us into wars, of course.
Yeah,
And beyond.
Context, complexity, perspective, interests.
All of it. Yeah.
So this is not a question that I would normally ask everyone, but it seems to be a theme in your work. So I'm wondering, do you think Gestalt is racist?
Wow, that's an interesting question.
I'm asking myself that, like, on a lot of different levels as a white Canadian in Mexico. So,
I can't say yes to that question, because honestly, the way Gestalt lives in me is how I internalized it and the experience that I went through, right? So, and I have to say, I have a terrible memory for specific theory and the things that I read. So I would have to go back and, pay more attention from that perspective. But for me,
you and many of us, I think, could go back with a critical perspective and look at it too.
And I think that's a worthy question, because I tend to think everything has, if you look at it from who built it, what the history was, right? And who the founders were, that racism is built into everything, right? So like my pat answer would be yes. And at the same time, when I look at the tools and how you use them and whether you can bring them and into the very same system to dismantle systems of oppression, I think there's great opportunity there. So,
well, at least, we have the theoretical support, which says, we're willing to undo the fixed Gestalt.
Yep.
But yeah.
But are we? Right. And so.
Yeah, in theory.
Right. And if you asked me, to look at the systems of even education around Gestalt, then absolutely. I won't go into any detail, but of course, every system I've been in, I've been able to see the racism that's built into it, right? So I just think the question is not whether it's there, it's whether and how whether we're willing and how we dismantle the system or make it more equitable. And I think we're on a long journey around that, a really long one. Yeah.
Well, it's also for Gestalt, it's in the whole field of mental health.
Yeah.
Which is.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
Interesting. So I am wondering where you see yourself going, or where you've actively planned to be going with projects and directions in the future. And also if you have any thoughts about where Gestalt might be headed.
In terms of my own career at the moment, I'm kind of in this, as I mentioned, time where I'm really reflecting on my practice and where I want to go. There's a couple directions I'm thinking about. One is deeper into coaching and teaching coaches, because I've just been loving that work so much. And the other is to, well, this is kind of, synergistic with this, to bring more skills in terms of social identity and social justice into the coaching field in general. I've just been I think that the reason that I started to get interested in it, actually, it's interesting that you mentioned therapy, was because I had some early experiences of therapy where my therapist was really not equipped at all to deal with issues of race, and it was harmful to me. And then when I started to pay attention to where coaches were, and the coaching field in general, and my colleague and I started to have conversations about it, we learned that most coach training programs don't teach coaches how to address issues of identity, and issues of power. And so, I just, from an empathetic place, was like, wow, how many coaching clients are not being served because of this?
Yeah.
So it's where my passion is right now. And
Hmm.
I think it is going to lead me to do more training, and teaching of coaches around these issues. So there's that. Diversity, equity, and inclusion will always be a part of what I do, right? And as will Gestalt. Um, I don't know where Gestalt is going. I really don't. I'm just going to say I don't know.
First, it has to become aware of where it is, then it can figure
There you
it out,
go.
right?
Let's do. Yes, exactly.
Needs to find itself and figure that out.
I think that's very true. Let's use the Gestalt terms. Yeah.
I did have one more question for you. And I thought it was interesting when you said second generation right off the bat. I was like, oh, I wonder second generation of what?
Mm.
But what stays with you, or what do you carry from the experience that your parents gave you, especially, I mean, you framed it in terms of their community and their social justice work. So I'm wondering if you'd like to say anything more about how that stayed with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's second generation. I was intending to say a couple things. One is organization development work, and then the other piece is the
Right,
social
sorry.
justice work. But I would say really it's around the values that they instilled in me. And, I just remember being a kid and having magnets on the fridge that I would stare at, that my parents put up there, and question authority was up there, and feel the fear and do it anyway, was up
To
there.
open the fridge.
Yeah, just to open the fridge. That was, those
Feel the fear, but do it anyway. That's awesome.
Oh, to open the fridge. Yes, exactly.
Sorry.
You never know what's going to be behind this door. So, they instilled these values of honesty, of truth, of authenticity, of really of justice, and of kindness. I would say, that definitely was a big part of what I learned from both of my parents, to be very loving and to also be very honest, and to have intent to build community and to regenerate community in healthy ways. So, I mean, we would just have really deep conversations around the dinner table all the time. And they would ask me, questions about what was going on with my friends, that, where I would be talking about the issues of equity, at a really young age. So that's what I mean. That's what stuck with me, was just the interest, ability, and commitment to do that.
Hmm. Hmm. And do you have any particular moments that have stayed with you, in terms of, I mean, a lot of people, they'll, tell me things that happen, and then 30 or 40 years later, if I ask them, do you have any particularly vivid memories of like that aha sort of illumination experience? They can hear the person's voice telling them a particular phrase 30 years later. I wonder, is there a moment or a story that has stayed with you?
That's interesting. In general, you mean
I mean,
across?
and this can go anywhere, but I mean, sometimes I ask it particularly in a Gestalt context, because sometimes those workshops that people describe as life-changing, that's exactly where that question takes them.
Right. That's good. Actually, I heard myself say it earlier, which is, someone in my Gestalt program said, say what is so when it's so, without shame, blame, or judgment. And it really stuck with me, just because it's so, you know, for me, it was very profound. And, there are things like that that stick with me that I will just hear myself playing out in my head. And that's very much one of them. There was another one I encountered recently that I actually have as a sticky that I'm looking at. I mentioned boundaries. It's boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. And it's Prentice Hempel. So things like that do stick with me, actually. So that's a great question. You're going to have me go, Heather, and start writing down the others.
Yeah, this is fodder for people's memoirs, right? It's just they're writing prompts, really.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah. Yeah, it's good stuff. So.
Well, is there anything that you would like to add at this point? Any part of yourself that's been missing, or final thoughts?
No, I think this covered it. I really appreciate all your questions and your curiosity. I can even see it in your face and kind of,
I know, I really enjoy meeting people, and I've really enjoyed being with you.
I
So
love
thank
it. I
you.
love it. Thank you. And you've actually given me a lot to reflect on as well. So it's one of the things I really love about these types of conversations that, I'll be unraveling some of the things we've talked about even more.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. We'll leave this here then.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Okay.